Picture this. It's July 2007, right? It's like a perfect summer night in chilly New York.
Hmm.
Fireflies are out, crickets chirping. Sounds pretty idyllic, right?
Yeah, sounds peaceful.
But for one family, the Sullivans, uh, this night marked the beginning of a nightmare that stretched on for over 15 years. Their 19-year-old son, Brian, vanished.
Just gone.
Gone. And here's the thing. When Brian's parents, Barbara and Dan, found his car abandoned, they weren't immediately worried.
Oh.
He had a habit of, taking off sometimes for a few days.
Ah. So maybe just crashing with friends or something.
Exactly. He'd even left a note. It said, going to Tim's. Be back Wednesday.
Eh.
But then you start noticing the little things, those details in the car.
What kind of details?
Well, like an empty Burger King bag and a receipt, time-stamped 5:38 a.m.
Yeah.
Who's getting Burger King at 5:38 in the morning unless something's wrong?
Yeah, it's pretty odd.
Then they find his driver's license is missing from his wallet. And when they check Brian's room, his toiletries are untouched, and there's a $700 check just sitting there, uncashed.
Yeah. Huh. Sounds like he was planning on a normal day and then poof, vanished.
Right. And, you mentioned Brian had taken off before, but this time felt different. The days stretched into weeks, and the investigation, it revealed a much more complicated story.
So what did they find out?
Well, investigators started piecing together Brian's movements. They knew he'd called his best friend Tim around 10 p.m. on July 7th. They talked about watching a movie. But then, early on July 8th, Tim gets these weird voicemails.
Where? How?
They said, this is the realm, this is the realm, this is the realm. And then another one, this is just a preview.
Ooh, spooky.
Yeah, they sound creepy out of context, but actually they're lyrics from a song Brian and Tim were writing together.
So a red herring.
It just shows how important context is in these cases. What seems bizarre can suddenly make sense with the right background. But even though the voicemails weren't as ominous as they first seemed, the mystery deepened. They confirmed Brian was seen at a Burger King drive-thru that morning, but after that his trail went cold. And then the case takes a turn with the emergence of a possible suspect, Derek Murray.
Okay, so who is Derek Murray?
Well, anonymous tips started coming in, pointing to Derek. Some said he and Brian had a fight. Some even mentioned a stabbing and a buried body.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot to sift through. Investigators had to be cautious, not jumping to conclusions.
Right. But it sounds like they were suspicious of Derek?
Oh, definitely. They started building a case. They put him under surveillance. They even used confidential informants to try and get more information. And then they came up with a plan to arrest Derek. Not for Brian's disappearance, but for welfare fraud.
Welfare fraud? What? Why?
It was a tactic. They hoped that getting him in custody, even for something unrelated, might pressure him into revealing something about Brian.
So kind of a gamble to force his hand.
Exactly. But just as they were closing in, something unexpected happened.
What was that?
Derek Murray suddenly died. Heart attack. Just days before his planned arrest.
Wow. So what happened to the investigation then?
Well, with Derek gone, the focus shifted entirely to finding Brian. Cadaver dogs, new searches, everything they could do to bring him home. But it brings up the human side of all this, right? Even with all the twists and turns, the real impact is on Brian's family.
Absolutely. That's what we're going to explore next. The impact of Brian's disappearance on his family and their ongoing search for answers. You know it's easy to get lost in the specifics, the evidence, the theories when you're looking at a case like this. But we can't forget that at the center of it all, there's a family just shattered by this loss.
Yeah. I mean, it's been over 15 years, and Brian's parents, Barbara and Dan, they haven't given up searching for answers.
Not for a second. And the sources we looked at, they really show how much they went through, especially in those first few weeks.
What was that like?
Well, Barbara, she would constantly go back to Leadington Avenue, that dead-end street where they found Brian's car. She'd walk those trails, just desperately searching for any sign of him.
It's that instinct, right? When something awful happens, you try to retrace their steps, hoping you'll find something, anything that makes it make sense.
Exactly. And they reached out to everyone who knew Brian, late-night phone calls, chasing down anything that might be a lead. They were clinging to that hope that someone, somewhere, had seen him. They even spent hours, just going through his phone records, trying to understand those last calls and messages.
Trying to put the pieces together, even though half of them were missing.
Right. And amidst all that searching, they still held on to those little reminders of the Brian they loved.
Yeah.
His sense of humor, his passion for music, those notebooks filled with lyrics.
It's like those details kept his memory alive.
Yeah.
Reminded everyone that he wasn't just a missing person. He was a young man with a whole life ahead of him.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the investigators even talked about how Brian was constantly writing down his thoughts, those little sparks of creativity. It's so sad to think that that was all cut short.
It really makes you think about the human cost of these cases.
Absolutely. You see this young man full of potential, and then suddenly he's just gone. It's a reminder that every missing person, they have a story, a life that mattered.
And it's not just Brian's family who are affected by this, right?
Of course not. The investigators, they carry that weight too. You know, the weight of this unsolved mystery.
I was reading about investigator Truya and his take on Derek Murray.
Yeah.
He described Derek as carrying like a heavy burden, like he was haunted by what happened.
That's an interesting way to put it. Even with all the suspicion around Derek, there's this sense that maybe he was struggling with his own demons, carrying the weight of his actions.
Yeah, but he never confessed, did he? He took whatever he knew to the grave.
He did. And that leaves us with so many questions, right? What really happened between Brian and Derek that night? Where are Brian's remains? Will his family ever find the closure they need?
It's been years, and those questions still hang over everyone.
They do. But even with all the uncertainty, there's still that hope that someday, somehow, Brian will be brought home.
It all comes back to hope, doesn't it?
It does. And you know, that's where our listeners come in. We've talked about the investigation, the theories, but there's also the power of collective memory.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, someone out there might have a piece of this puzzle without even realizing it. Think about those small details that shaped the early investigation. The Burger King receipt, the missing license, those voicemails.
Right. They helped build a timeline,
Yeah.
tell a story. You're saying our listeners might have similar pieces, memories that could shed light on this.
Exactly. Maybe you knew Brian, maybe you crossed paths with Derek Murray, or maybe you were in Chile back in 2007 and you saw something unusual, something that just felt off.
So even if it seems small, even if you're not sure it matters, it could be important.
Absolutely. That memory could be the key. So we're asking everyone listening, think back, search your memories. Maybe you have something that could bring peace to Brian's family, something that could finally let them lay their son to rest.
It's a lot to ask, but sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference.
And as we get to the end of our deep dive into Brian Sullivan's disappearance, there's one thought we want to leave you with. Imagine for a second you're Brian's parents. Every day, waking up with that same weight in your chest, the same unanswered questions, that ache for your son.
It's hard to even grasp that kind of pain, isn't it? The not knowing, the constant wondering.
And yet they haven't given up. They're still searching, holding on to hope. And there are people like Investigator Truya, the Crime Stoppers, who are still working on this case.
It's amazing, right? That commitment to justice, that refusal to let go of hope.
Absolutely. And it shows that even after all this time, there's still a chance for answers.
And that's why we're here, talking about Brian's case, reaching out to you, our listeners. Because sometimes all it takes is one person, one memory, to break a case wide open.
You might think, what could I possibly know that would help now? But you'd be surprised. Cases have been solved based on the smallest things. A song someone heard, a license plate they jotted down, even a dream that triggered a memory.
The human mind, it's a strange thing. Those tiny details can pop up when you least expect it.
Exactly. So if you have any connection to this case, anything at all, please don't dismiss it.
Maybe you were living in Chile back then. Maybe you knew Brian. Maybe you just passed through town and saw something a little off.
It might feel small. You might be hesitant. But even so, reach out to the Crime Stoppers or the Monroe County Sheriff's Office.
You really could be the key to solving this and bringing peace to Brian's family.
And as we close out our deep dive into Brian Sullivan's disappearance, we want to leave you with this. What if this was your child, your brother, your friend?
Wouldn't you want someone, anyone, to come forward with even the tiniest bit of information that could bring them home?
Sometimes the smallest act of courage can make the biggest difference. Thanks for listening.